Good evening. Welcome to the second week of the graphics project. Before I introduce the lecture, I'd like to remind you that as part of the second week of this event, we'll have a number of presentations tomorrow at 10 a.m. and 1 a.m. and also a workshop on Sunday. I don't know, Forrest, whether we should give details or the information which is presented there is enough. Narrative and type history and anatomy in the morning, and college management in the afternoon, followed by a workshop on Sunday, also led by Forrest Jesse. Yep. So today we have the second keynote lecture of the event. It is really a pleasure for me to introduce Tom Weaver, a friend of the school and a friend as well. It's a pleasure also that he's giving a presentation on AA files again. He took part about 2 years ago in the series Arguments, which we hold as part of the AAD during the summer, and gave a fantastic presentation on the project. Tom is the managing editor of AA publications, and also the editor of AA files. In fact, I would say that he kind of single-handedly resurrected AA files and put it basically at what I would consider its best position in history, despite its extraordinary history. It's really a fantastic project he's made, and it will be a pleasure to see him presenting it again. Tom, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that very nice introduction, Enrique. And thanks too to Columbia for the kind invitation to come here today. And I'm also kind of thankful, I guess, that I'm a psychiatrist. I didn't realize this was something one had to aspire to, but if it was, it would have been a footballer or a taxi driver. So the irony of my kind of talk tonight, this afternoon, is that for a presentation about editing, you'll soon discover that I have perhaps kind of too many slides. So I'm clearly in need of editing myself. But my hope is that these slides are going to pass so fast in front of your eyes that the whole presentation is going to become almost animated. But anyway, just bear with me. And I wanted to begin neither with editing nor even with damnation, but with a bit of kind of historical context. Because it's a context that's manifestly affected what I edit and the way I edit. So I work at the AA School of Architecture in London. A school of architecture structured not as a campus or an institution, but as a house and a club. And so like any good English club, the school overlooks a Georgian square in Bloomsbury in central London. And inside its attic rooms, you can find the school's design studios. While its inner terrace and courtyard areas also act as teaching spaces. And its grand first floor piano nobile contains the school library. While lower down there's a restaurant where staff and students eat. And with its kitchen in the basement. But more than the library and the dining room and the teaching spaces, though, historically the core spaces of the AA have been its club rooms, where students, members, and anyone interested meets and talks mostly about architecture. And these conversations are fueled by the central and most important space of the AA bar. Now, for the last 170 years or so, this has been a house and a club and a school and a culture that has nurtured thousands and thousands of architectural graduates, as well as establishing and preserving certain rituals and acting as a focus through which to promote the very best and most original thinking about architecture, hosting figures like Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, Albert Aalto in the middle. That's Peter Smithson. He's actually holding up St. Paul's Cathedral, but the photograph is so sort of faded out, you've lost the cathedral now. And Cedric Price. Now, more pertinently for us now, this architectural promotion from its very first days in the mid-19th century has also taken the form of publications, particularly in the form of books and journals. The mandate to produce these publications is even written into the AA's founding charter, that in order to be considered an association and a school, the AA legally has to publish books and journals. So no journal, no school. And so what you see here is not simply the first ever AA journal, but the satisfying of terms in a contract. This, therefore, is a receipt. AA Notes itself, which began with the founding of the AA in the 1840s, ran through the whole second half of the 19th century and into the early years of the 20th century. It was then succeeded by the AA Journal, which, like AA Notes, combined minutes of AA meetings and transcripts of talks and lectures with commissioned articles on architecture. The AA Journal itself then went through various designed and edited iterations throughout the 1930s, 40s and 50s. That's one from 1950, October 50. But by the 1960s, the journal was reborn again as Arena. And it's in Arena that you can see the first signs of kind of a pop culture starting to be absorbed into AA, with Vanessa Redgrave on the right peeking out. That's Vanessa Redgrave in Blow Up, peeking out in the collage cover. And then Arena, in turn, changed again as the magazine was reborn as AAQ, the Architectural Association Quarterly, which was edited by a man named Dennis Sharp. And then finally, in 1981, this lineup of house journals changed one more time and was relaunched as AA Files, which continues to this day. So that's basically AA Files from 1980 through to about 3 or 4 years ago, and some of the journals I've edited. Now, at the same time, the AA's publishing efforts have not been restricted only to magazines and journals, but have taken in numerous other titles, as the AA developed its own publishing house. And these titles range from anthologies of student, staff and design work to kind of luxurious but somewhat mannered architectural projects masquerading as books, to rather gnomic but not uninteresting architectural manifestos and the return to the idea of the architect as theorist, to unique and kind of wonderful architectural histories, and more recently to pocketbooks of architectural writing. So my role at the AA today is to edit all of these things, which I do with a small team of 1 other editor and 3 graphic designers, producing between 50 and 20 books every year. And I'm also the editor of AA Files, which I produce twice a year. I do also have another life at the AA teaching architectural history, but for today I'm just going to concentrate on my editing, and in particular I just want to focus on my work on the journal, on AA Files. And then just lastly, to kind of wrap up this sort of long, overly long contextual preamble, I just wanted to say that despite the bombasticism of my title and the seeming grandeur of my responsibilities, I'm also basically just the latest in a long line of AA editors. There have been lots of editors before me, and lots more will succeed me. And like many people at the AA, I'm really just kind of making it up as I go along. A suspicion slightly confirmed to me by the recent arrival of my AA corporate credit card, where my name is listed as T. Weaver, Architectural Ass. It even has a horse on the cover. But I think a bit of self-deprecation, a bit of self-doubt is no bad thing. So back to the editing. There's also very obviously today, outside of this sort of historical context and educational context, lots and lots of other editors around, and loads of architectural journals. And the stuff of this editorial output is increasingly becoming the de facto subject for all architectural investigations. A point borne out by the success of Clip Stamp Fold, which emanated from my own alma mater, Princeton University, which now, in architecture at least, presents itself as a kind of shrine to the worship of all things mediated, edited, and designed. Or by this is Clipstamp Fold's Bastard Child, Archizines, an exhibition of so-called independent architectural publishing that tours the world and in the process encourages more new journals to be absorbed into the exhibition. So it grows. And in its growth, it promotes all those self-generated publishing initiatives where the editor is not just the editor, but the client, the patron, the commissioner, producer, and consumer all in one. An abundance of roles that paradoxically seems to question the separate existence of the editor. Instead, I think we should reaffirm the autonomy and necessity of the editor. For they do a vital role. They improve text and make writing better. But still, who is the editor, and what kind of editor should we aspire to be? Is this the ideal? The editor as haircut, the editor-in-chief, like a kind of commander-in-chief? Or is this the perfect editor? The Daily Bugle's John Jonah Jameson Jr., Peter Parker's editor? Or this other newspaper editor? This is the great Joseph Robards playing Ben Bradley, the Washington Post's editor, in All the President's Men. A sort of foul-mouthed, draconian, but at heart sort of fundamentally paternal editor. Now, for many editors, though, the definitive editor as hero is this man. This is Gordon Lish, who was the literary editor at Alfred Knopf in the 1960s and 70s, and in this role he edited a great deal of contemporary American fiction, including much of the work of Richard Ford and Don DeLillo. In particular, though, he edited all of the writings of this man. This is Raymond Carver. Now, Lish is famous for the extent of his editing. He was no copy editor, simply correcting the spelling and grammar of his writers, but an editor who radically transformed the text in front of him. So here, for example, is Lish's edit of Carver's short story Beginners, which Lish retitles what we talk about when we talk about love. So on the screen, you can see the extent of his editing. Lish changes the names of Carver's characters and ruthlessly trims and cuts the text into what readers would soon celebrate as Carver's characteristically spare and minimal prose. Now, Lish became famous, or rather infamous, pulled out from relative anonymity when, after Carver's death, his widow published Carver's preferred manuscript with its original title, Beginners. And when you read Beginners, you can immediately see that Lish's version is so much better. And so this episode has become a kind of cautionary tale, a bedtime story that editor fathers tell their editor children at night, of the dangers of what happens when you forsake editing, of editing or damnation. Now, in architectural editing, there seems to be no such heroes. And this is in spite of the kind of amazing fact that basically the greatest movements in 20th century architecture all began as magazines, with their architects all first starting out as editors. So this is Le Corbusier, an editor and inspiring architect, who went on to have not an insignificant career after editing Esprit Nouveau. Or the young German editor Mies van der Rohe, who edited G. Or the Dutch editor Theo van Doesburg, who edited De Stijl. There's even a case for arguing that Peter Eisenman, seen here willingly, he's posing as a hear no evil ape. It's a trilogy of photographs of Hear No Evil, See No Evil, Speak No Evil, who along with Ken Frampton and Julia Bloomfield edited Oppositions while directing the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, is a far more productive editor than he is an architect. And his wife, Cynthia Davison, who I had the pleasure to work with for a number of years, through her work with Eni and Log, is really the single most important architectural editor of the last 25 years. Now, within the specifics of English architectural editing, it's hard to find architects as editors. the only really great English editor in the post-war period was this woman. This is Monica Pidgeon, who was the formidable editor of Architectural Design, or AD magazine, from 45 to 75. So here she is again with her young technical assistant editors. That's Peter Murray on the right of the screen, and a very, very young Ken Frampton on the left of the screen. Robin Middleton, who many of you will be familiar with, also worked with her at the time. I mean, I use the image just because I like the idea of the editing house being a form of training outside of the academy for aspiring academics. And here are some of the covers of AD that Monica Pidgeon edited. Her tenure saw her give particular attention to emerging movements in English architectural design, from the independent group through to Cedric Price and Archigram. Because of these associations, in the early 70s, AD had a particularly strong relationship to the AA. In many ways, more than AAQ, AD was the AA's house journal in the first half of the 1970s. Now, its English and London rival was the Architectural Review, which Nicholas Pevsner, who you see here, edited during the war years, while the nominal editor, J.M. Richards, was on active war duty. But the Architectural Review's executive editor for 50 years, from the 1920s through to the mid-1970s, was this man. This is Hubert de Kroning Hastings, HDC, who, in contrast to Monica Pidgeon's command of architectural imagery, established the AR as host and patron to a fantastic assortment of writers, including Raina Banham, Colin Rowe, John Summerson, Alan Colquhoun, but also more enigmatic literary figures like Evelyn Waugh and the poet laureate John Betjeman. So the AR then offered a model of the architectural editor as public intellectual. Hastings was also, interestingly, the only editor ever to win the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, gold medal. Now, the AR under Hastings also had a very distinct graphic identity. It used very sort of radical tricks. Hastings believed in the idea that every single page should be different. And this is as far back as 1945. This is successive issues of AR magazine, so the July and then August 1945 issues. And the entire, other than the format, the whole magazine changes. I don't think you ever see that even today with a magazine changing everything about its masthead, its graphics, its whole visual identity between successive issues. And in the 1950s, the AR also developed a very effective design template for its inner pages that always separated text on the right from the image on the left, indulging in both by giving them their own sort of separate pages. And it used wonderful black and white photography and nice coloured paper stocks. And so the Architectural Review, basically for me, from 1947 and Colin Rowe's Mathematics of the Ideal Villa to the rumpus in the letters pages of the AR in 1975 and the lead up to the publication of Collage City, that basically for me represents an editorial paradigm, and it's one that I keep returning to time and time again. But in thinking again about a kind of cartoon caricature of an editor, I also realized that the other editorial models available to me were the directors of the AA school itself. So here, for example, is Alvin Boyarsky, who ran the AA from 1971 to 1990, presenting himself not as a figure of pedagogical or professorial authority, but of editorial control. And so we see him in this photograph, which he himself choreographed, sitting at his desk as if he were an editor. He has 3 telephones, an in-tray and an out-tray, and a desk strewn with editorial papers. Now, consistent with the associations of this image, or architectural associations, Boyarsky ran the AA as if it were an editorial project. A project that went beyond his endorsement of books and journals into all aspects of the school's cultural and didactic production. Perhaps the most radical of these was his launching of the AA's own TV station, TVAA. Following this launch, all lectures were filmed on video and broadcast again later. This is Raina Banham lecturing at a splinter AA initiative called ArtNet. And in this great, really emblematic photograph by Dennis Crompton, member of Archigram, it shows that from then onwards we only increasingly registered the existence of someone when they appeared to us framed through the TV screen, even if that someone was standing in front of us. Boyarsky himself was not camera shy and also appeared on TVAA. Here he is interviewing Peter Eisenman, who I realize now keeps popping up in these slides. And so what was once would have been an academic event, two architects talking about architecture in a lecture hall full of students, now becomes a media event, two personalities talking about architecture in a studio in front of only a TV camera. Now the cultural and editorial shift that Boyarsky enacted at the AA can also be seen very clearly through images of one man. This is Cedric Price. And here he is when he's very, very young in the 1960s as a studio tutor, as a critic. So he's just doing a desk crit there. Now if we scan forward 10 years, he's no longer in the studio, but he's in front of an audience, giving and delivering these famously entertaining lectures at regular intervals. 3 years later still, in another famous photograph, here he is aware of his own mediarization, taking a picture of the photographer who is taking his picture. This is a kind of Las Meninias moment for the AA. And here is Cedric Price again, transformed even further. Once a young academic and studio tutor, then a kind of guru and image artist, he now makes the ultimate rise into an image-heavy universe and becomes host to an AA TV show on, of course, the most important subject of all, not buildings, but architectural magazines. This was a weekly show where he reviewed the papers, basically, reviewed the magazines. Now, after Boyarsky's death in 1990, successive directors of the AA have continued to cast themselves as editors, with varying degrees of success. From Alan Balfour, who you can see here, who ran the school from 1990 to 1995. No telephones, you notice, and much less a desk strewn with editorial papers. And then Balfour was succeeded by Mohsen Mostafavi, who was the director for 10 years, from 1995 to 2005. So the telephone is back, you can see. And so too is the bust of Inigo Jones that always sat behind Boyarsky. But Inigo Jones is looking at Mohsen, and Mohsen is looking at Inigo Jones as slightly warily of each other, as if unconvinced of each other. And then lastly to today's director, Brett Steele, who perhaps more than any of his immediate predecessors has pushed the AA's editorial agenda, not least in choosing to stage this image of himself as a man lost within the magnitude of his own editorial output. Now this in turn prompts all kinds of editorial associations, from the editor as megalomaniac, to the editor as collector, to the editor as statesman and connoisseur. This is Maurice Janou's wonderful Paris-Match photograph of André Malraux. Like the image of Brett Steele, you know the image has been staged because all of the pages are facing the camera, not the editor, who is just posing. Through all these kinds of image references, there seems to be something paradoxical about editing. The conventional view of the editor is one that envisages the editorial mandate as one of shortening, of cutting, of removal and abbreviation. But as these images show, within the figure of the editor and the role of editing, there is simultaneously an opposing process of assemblage, of generating stuff, of collecting writers and images, of acquisition. Editing then does two opposite things at exactly the same time. Now at some point, you're going to have to set aside all of these images of editors, all these paradigms and ideals, histories and paradoxical inversions, and get down to the task of actually editing something. And you need to do this because you have a journal to produce. And remember, without a journal at the AA, there is no AA, there is no school, and so there's a lot at stake. And so you start to think about what kind of journal you want, that it should be eclectic but scholarly, full of good images, but to distinguish it from pretty much every other architectural journal, it should also be full of good writing. After all, architecture is a language. And in looking around for writers and critics, you happen to meet a really interesting, frighteningly intelligent, young Italian architectural historian, and you commission him to write something. English is obviously not his first language, and so the grammar and the syntax is all over the place. But the piece is so full of good ideas that it doesn't matter. Your task then is to make it read beautifully, sonorous, mellifluous, learned, fast-paced. You are there not just to fix the typos, but to transform it, to do a Gordon Lish on it, to make people want to read the thing, make it memorable. So this is basically me editing. It's a real phony. I've just obviously made this screen grab film, but it's based on an original unedited text that Pier Vittorio Orelli sent me for an earlier issue of A-Files. And what I'm inputting here is my edit. I just thought I'd show you the actual process. It's slightly speeded up, so I don't actually type that quickly. So the first things you do, obviously, I mean, I had a colleague, my predecessor at A-Files was a woman called Mary Wall, who edited the journal for 20 years. And she'd call what I'm doing here knitting, which is basically just formatting the thing. All of those first moves, changing the font to one that you're happy with, changing the format of the page, setting the language to English, not US English. The default setting of Microsoft. Hilariously with Pier Vittorio, perhaps the foremost Renaissance scholar in the world, can't spell the word Renaissance. So you do find and replace. This is for Renaissance. It reminds me, I've got a friend who's a psychotherapist who writes a lot of books, and he can't spell the word neuroses. So after the base level knitting is done, you actually then start the task of, I begin at the beginning. I don't like to edit out of sequence. So you look at titles. In the end, I prefer single word titles rather than single construct titles rather than colons separating a subtitle. In the end, we put the subtitle back in. So this is going to play itself out, just simply showing me edit the first paragraph. I mean, there's other little basic rules I like to do. Nabokov had a great rule, which was no successive paragraph should begin with the same word. And also I think less confident writers often begin with a definitive article the whole time. The always begins the sentence. So paragraphs often read like bullet points. So you have the, or you have always the subject of the sentence at the beginning of the sentence. So I try and create links. I try and smooth it out. Again, more typos. And I never do this with track changes on. All those arrows, all those colours, all those boxes drive me crazy. And I asked Pier Vittorio about this. He was cool. I'm not doing this behind his back. Okay, one more. This is the same piece that he sent me. So this is his great essay on Palladio. And this is just a section of text further into the essay. And again, I just wanted to do this just to show you, I mean, it's partly one of the great things about Pier Vittorio, not someone whose English is not his first language. He's actually very, very easy to edit for me because he always writes about ideas. That the idea is always the structuring mechanism for each of his sentences. It's much easier to edit an idea than it is to edit a fact, or if someone's just referencing someone or playing into a lineage, because then you have to always just check the accuracy of the fact, and then as well as smoothing it out. So my job here is simply to look at transitions, of switching one sentence into another. The other really nice thing he does is that he always writes off inversions. So with Palladio in particular, he lends himself to that. It's always about insides as outsides. It's about rural villas masquerading as urban palazzos. It's about symmetry and asymmetry. It's about Venice, this is the great conclusion to the piece, it's about Venice not being actually an aquatic, watery universe, but a landed, earthly, terrestrial one. And again, what I'm doing here is trying to find synonyms, you know, removing repetitions, and slightly spelling it out for the reader. So it sometimes lends itself a rather didactic tone, but Pier Vittorio is an academic and a lecturer, and it's a tone that isn't entirely alien to him. So when you put in other words, when you have these thus constructions, it's him lecturing as well as him writing. I read it through first, and it's always, there's lots of phone calls and lots of discussions, so it's never just raw. And as you'll see here, I add things as well, and I'm not doing that just willfully, but I do that after lots of discussion. I mean, I personally quite like the parenthetical form, so that you know, writing in parentheses after a sentence, which gives that slight side of the mouth aspect of writing, as if there's a slight degree of schizophrenia in the way someone is actually revealing an idea, but it's nice. It just shows that there's another figure there, another kind of, you can be slightly cheekier, or you can be more iconoclastic, or you can be a slightly different person through parentheses. So you're about to see the sort of addition that I added. But again, it's something that I did purely in the sort of spirit of Pier Vittorio, and this is after the end of lots of phone discussions and conversations. And it's me reiterating an idea that he's already had. But I like that. I like ending a paragraph with a form of synonym, of saying the same thing again, but ever so slightly different. It also provides a nice link to the next paragraph. Again, slightly less confident writers always leave everything in a rather abrupt way, so paragraphs are entirely autonomous. You never get a kind of link, you never get a flow. The best writing is read fast, it's really pacey. So word counts don't really matter to me so much. I'm much more interested in pace. You know, a bad writer can write a really slow 1,000 words, and a good writer can write an incredibly fast 10,000 words. So I just want pace all the time. This is a sort of tick of mine that Pier Vittorio does now with the then. So fundamentally then, that little, it's like a sort of algebraic equation where you introduce that sort of sense of logic. Just wraps up a paragraph. Now the models I always have in the back of my mind when I'm editing are basically literary, not academic. And in actual fact, it's the terrible forced language of academicism that I'm trying to edit out of the texts I receive. There's a great YouTube video of a lecture at Rice by Bob Sommel from 2010. And in this lecture, Sommel challenges much of the kind of verbiage of bad academicism. And in particular, he questions the preponderance of the itty form of words over his preferred ism words. Sommel argues for less itties and more isms. And so materiality, bad. Materialism, good. Practicality, bad. Pragmatism, good. Community, bad. Communism, good. Now the really big one for me though, which strangely Sommel slightly passes over, is criticality versus criticism, with the latter being so much better than the former. Sommel's argument is that the itty is a bureaucratic language of policy, whereas ism is a language of politics and ideas. But I think you can also introduce an aesthetic or literary dimension to their differences. The itties are all terrible words because they read and sound so bad, and we shouldn't ever use them, especially criticality, or even worse, disciplinarity, or its evil twin, interdisciplinarity. I won't ever publish a text within AA Files if any of those three words are in it, which pretty much rules out anyone who's ever written for October magazine. Now, the counter position is equally hazardous. A few years ago, I went to a lecture at the AA by Peter Cook, founding member of Archigram, famous countercultural figure, and a man who has run schools of architecture in the UK and Germany, in the process defining the education of a whole generation of architects. At this lecture, Cook declared that architectural discussion has been hijacked by people who call themselves architectural theorists, and the efforts of teachers and other intellectuals to divert young architects' interest away from themes to abstracts have been pernicious and so needs to be redressed. Now, this seemed a bit rich to me. A man who has never actually built anything, and is all the more interesting because of that, suddenly starts insisting that architecture only exists at a physical level, and that we should throw away our books and our theories. And so for me, in editing architecture, I find myself having to tiptoe on the one hand between a cult of criticality and its rather over-entitled obscurantism, and on the other hand, a reactionary literalism that denies the importance of anything other than the physical object. Now, instead, what I like to focus on is language itself. People, I think, should be more attentive to the words they use, that they should aspire to more writerly models and should certainly read more widely, especially fiction, because that's where the really good writing resides. And it certainly doesn't reside in academia. And so this line by my friend, the psychotherapist and essayist Adam Phillips, this is the guy who can't spell neurosis, could very easily substitute architecture for psychoanalysis and be the banner under which I like to edit. Now, as a kind of parlour game that we could sort of play now, we can reintroduce and familiarise ourselves with some other great lines, all being the first lines to their respective books. And so you'd obviously have Jane Austen, or Melville's Moby Dick, or Dostoevsky, or Proust's fantastic opener to À la Recherche, or Isherwood, or Salinger's fantastic Catcher in the Rye. Now, if you try and play the same game with art and architectural writing, though, it's much, much harder. But still, if you look hard, you can find some good examples. So here's Gombrich's great beginning. First line, again, these are all first lines to the story of art. Not simply just a good line, but also a really interesting idea. Or surprisingly, here's one even from Pevsner. In no sense a man with a light, writerly touch, but he still managed one of the great openings. Now, if we continue this game but change the rules slightly, it's much, much easier to find really terrible opening lines in architectural writing. And all one has to do is look at the canon. So this, for example, is the first line of Hitchcock and Johnson's The International Style. A terrible opening. Or Siegfried Gideon. Too often eulogized, never denigrated enough. Aimless and day-to-day. It's a terrible opening. Here's Wolf Lynn. Do you really want to keep reading this book? Or I realise also I'm slightly being evil here because these are all translated. So none of these authors have actually written these lines, but they have. Again, I mean, this is really bad, isn't it? Now, interestingly, to this list of really duff opening sentences, you can even add Banham, the great Rayner Banham, whose first sentence to Theory and Design is spectacularly turgid. And remember, Theory and Design was his PhD that he wrote with Pevsner. Again, a terrible opening line. Now, but what makes Banham so utterly lovable is that the last two lines of the book, so the last lines, are totally wonderful. And so what theory and design really is, much more than an architectural survey history, is Banham teaching himself how to write. Now, I would argue that in learning how to write, Banham was also casting off 200 years of largely German academic tradition that in many ways continues to dictate how schools and universities and most journals write about architecture. Heavy on research and lineages and data, light on ideas and iconoclasm, and any literary finesse. So these are the figures who basically determined academically how we write about architecture. And they are, from top left, in each row, chronologically, Winkelmann, Semper, Burckhardt, Riegel, Wolflin, Gideon, Panofsky, Gombrich, Wittkower, and Pevsner. I mean, scarily, one can even insert oneself into this sort of canon. Pevsner taught Banham. Banham taught my professor, Adrian Forty, who taught me. So I am tragically in that list. Now instead, I think we should look to another writerly tradition with its own corresponding set of figures. Again, from the top left, this is Bacon, Milton, Johnson, Hazlitt, Lamb, Ruskin, De Quincey, Pater, Chesterton, Strachey, Woolf, Huxley, Orwell, and Hitchens, all of whom wrote not treatises or academic papers, but only and ever essays. And it's the essay as model, or as Adorno would say, the essay as form, that I use for all of the A.A. Files pieces, because the essay allows for scholarship that is readable, and for both ideas and iconoclasm, for deference and mischief, for detail and for pace. And interestingly, this form of writing about architecture, although largely extinct now, was the norm for a generation of English critics and historians, beginning with John Summerson. This is John Summerson in the Soane Museum, which he directed, standing in the mirror, so there's actually two John Summersons. And again, if we play the same parlour game, the first line test, Summerson just breezes through this test in that nice, didactic, but accessible way he had with writing in the beginning of the classical language of architecture. Or Colin Rowe, who's a totally different kind of man, totally different kind of writer, but again, he only really wrote in the essay form. So here's a random first line by Colin Rowe. Always essays again, but they're much more prompted by the spoken word. Everything with Rowe is oral. It's no accident that his collected essays is called As I Was Saying. So you have that nice aphoristic, anecdotal style of writing. Or Alan Colquhoun, perhaps less fluid as a writer, but still wholeheartedly committed to the essay. Here's one of Colquhoun's more poetic opening lines. Now, Colquhoun was also the only one of these writers to explicitly acknowledge this form of writing. This is a letter to his friend Jacques Goubler that Alan himself passed on to me when I used to keep nagging him to sort of tell me more about his allegiance to the essay form. Can you read it okay? Do you want me to read it? Dear Jacques, I'm not going to do Alan Colquhoun's voice. Some thoughts on the essay. The essay is not merely a quirky Anglo-Saxon genre puzzling to all continental Europe. It's an important aspect of the Enlightenment, French, Scottish, English, which emerged in the early 18th century, part of the evolution of communication, combining learned ideas with popular expression, helping the creation of a practical public realm, Habermas, the structural transformation of the public sphere. This is classic Colquhoun. He sort of puts a footnote into a letter. But also, more remotely, the essay can be seen as a small part of the history of rhetoric, dating from the Renaissance, which moved knowledge, both reason and understanding, from the hands of specialists to the hands of all educated people. Tafuri, Venice and the Renaissance. Love Alan. What a great letter. Now, again, this is all, again, part of that same lineage, and they're all arranged chronologically. Following Colquhoun, and just a few months younger than Colquhoun, was, of course, Banham himself, the most fluent of all architectural writers. If you read A Critic Writes, his collection of writings, Every single piece is written as an essay. Again, Banham smokes through the first line test. And then lastly, the AA's own Robin Evans, a proper essayist, not only in the way he wrote, but in his autodidacticism. He's entirely self-taught. He's not a product of the academy, but of the club, of the AA, the house club. And it was Evans who wrote perhaps the greatest architectural first line of all, this amazing beginning to Figures, Doors and Passages. Now the sad thing now is, where have all the architectural essayists gone? Michael Sorkin was pretty good for a while in his Village Voice years, and Sanford Quinter has had his occasional moments, but who right now writes architectural essays? It's very difficult to think of anyone, and so that's what I've tried to make AA Files, a journal not of papers and manifestos, but of essays, of criticism, not criticality, not just because this model is extinct and I want to bring it back to life, but because the essay represents the best form of non-fiction writing. Now, being a school journal, I also like to think that this way of writing can be reabsorbed back into the academy. I mean, why does a PhD or a master's thesis have to be written like they are? Has anyone ever read a PhD that is good to read? No. I mean, I've read hundreds, and they're all terrible. So why don't we rip up the tired old 19th century German Humboldt template of writing a PhD and all that nonsense about it being research? You know, that's another one of my absolutely hated words, research. And instead teach people to write the thing in such a way that someone would enjoy reading it. So it would privilege ideas, it would privilege sentences. Now that would be really radical, no? Now the other thing I think we should start attacking, and I realise I have to tread slightly softly here, is the notion that the only true writing on architecture comes from the architect. And I think we should attack this in this particular instance because, firstly, I believe there are other architects out there worth discussing than just Rem Koolhaas. And why should we always revere Koolhaas as we do? Secondly, I think always promoting the practitioner's project text means ignoring what the critic or commentator or historian has to say, which, counter to this statement here on the screen, is actually always more interesting. And thirdly, I think we should attack this because it's not true. Because architects are actually terrible writers. I mean, awful. But what they are almost universally brilliant at, though, is talking. Architects are genius talkers. I would always rather listen to an architect than read one. And so in AA Files, I also wanted to introduce another form of writing alongside the essay that would capture the way architects mostly spoke and expressed themselves. Now, the model I adopted for this, I shamelessly stole from the literary journal, the Paris Review, which has always run conversations with writers, and in every single issue, it's always the best bit in the issue, the conversations they do. And so I've done exactly the same thing, commissioning for each of the issues I've edited 1 or 2 conversations. The conversations I do are also slightly different from those in the Paris Review, in that they're huge. Often nearly 20,000 words long. But the colloquial form of them means reading them is really, really fast. And they also differ in that they're nearly always structured through the depiction of a life. It's one of architecture's great oddities to me that how few architectural autobiographies or just biographies there are available compared to, say, art history or literature. So the conversations I commission are autobiographies through conversation. I'm much, much more interested in an architect's life than I am in their projects. And more generally, I think a journal of conversations is so much more in keeping with the AA as a club, because what's the stuff of a club if not conversation? So I just want to play you, I'm going to play you a few audio clips now. So these have been drawn, I think there's 4 or 5, and they're drawn from the conversations I've commissioned. And I'm doing it so that you can actually hear the way people talk. And then at the same time, you'll see on the screen how I've edited it. So there'll be obviously a difference between the talking and the actual published form. But I still try and capture the colloquialism of the way they speak when I edit it. And I realize here at Columbia, there's nothing especially radical about this. As I was speaking to Daniel Tausnick about this, that Columbia has its own oral history department and program, which seems to me a fantastic resource to have. Now this first one is John Winter, who's a little known but really interesting English architect in the 50s, 60s and 70s. He sadly died just a few months after I recorded this, so this is one of the last times he was actually speaking about his work and about architecture. This might be a bit silent, but we'll see how it goes.
When I lived in Camden Town, there was a chap in the house next door who was worked for an advertising agency. In fact, he had his own advertising agency. And then he came back one evening, he said to me, "John, I'm fed up with advertising, boring world. I'm going to take up sheep farming." He said it just like that. And I said to him, "I could be born to be a sheep farmer. It's a third generation sheep farmer." He said, "No, I'm going to be a sheep farmer." So he went to Swiss Cottage Library and said, "What have you done in sheep farming?" And he read all the books, and 3 years later he was the chair of the West Riding National Union of Farmers. So he really made it.
And this was
There's 6,000 sheep.
That was his
He
father's.
bought this house, and I'd walk around the edge of the property with him at night, and someone would go, "Bah!" and he'd say, "Hello, Bridget." He knew them all by name. So that was his house, which we gutted and refurbished, built an extension.
So obviously not entirely serious, but still you get to kind of hear the guy. You get to see how he tells a story. He's very good at telling stories, John Winter. Here's another kind of classically self-deprecatory story. The first voice you're going to hear here is Adrian Forties, who did the conversation with me.
Who else of your contemporaries did you admire? Sterling?
He's not a contemporary.
He was older.
I had a conversation with Jim Sterling. We shared a flat together with Sam Stevens once. And during that time I got to know him fairly well, obviously we were sharing a flat. And I can remember we were out having a walk, and he said to me, he said, "John, there are two types of architects. There are people like Philip Johnson and myself who will design the key buildings for humanity. And then the people who design all the boring buildings in between, designed by people like you." And I thought, that's bloody rude, but absolutely correct, which makes it worse. And I think he was absolutely dead right.
That one was so nice that I pulled it out of the sequence and used it as the last line. I like the conversations to end with a bit of a bang. This one is, for me, far and away the best thing I've ever published. This is Peter Carl in conversation with Columbia's own Robin Middleton, and it explains the origins of his snakeskin jackets.
Living actually came out of the way we travelled. In a sense, we gradually divested ourselves of having a dining room table and chairs, if you see what here, or a three-piece suite and things like that. And we had a little house in Morocco, and we learned to sit on cushions and eat our food with our fingers and all that sort of stuff. And I think the great change came not only by going to Kathmandu or whatever and coming back and sitting on cushions and that sort of thing, but when we came back from Kathmandu, we brought some Tibetan cushions back with us, and they happened to be impregnated with moth eggs. And we were living at that time in Cromwell Road, and Ruth didn't want to live in a 5-story terrace house, so we moved into a ground floor flat with an enormous garden with lovely fig trees and plane trees, and it was beautiful, although it was in Cromwell Road. But it also, we'd taken it as it was, and it had wall-to-wall carpeting in it. And the moths began to multiply, and they not only ate the wall-to-wall carpeting, they ate all my perfectly tailored huntsman suits, which all my suits had been tailored by huntsmen when I was at Cambridge. They gradually got moth holes in them and things like that. So I stopped wearing suits. That's when I took up snakeskin jackets, because the moths wouldn't eat them.
That's wonderful. Everybody knows your snakeskin jacket.
And we rang up the Kensington pest control people, and they came around and they were entranced. They'd never seen such moths in their lives, and they said yes, they could get rid of them, but we'd have to actually not have the animals in the house for 3 months at least, after they'd sprayed it and fumigated and whatever. And we said no, we'd rather have our dogs and cats. We had 2 dogs and 2 cats then, and so we lived with the moths, and they changed our lives in a way.
Okay, just 2 more. This is Massimo Scolari, who I interviewed with Leah Catherine Zacca in Venice in his amazing palazzo during Chipperfield's Common Ground Biennale.
You know, after 40 years, 50 years of looking drawing, it takes you 2 seconds to see from a drawing if somebody is gifted or not.
And also to see
It's
if they have
like
knowledge or...
It's like to the musician. If you go to the school of music and you witness a selection for singers, do re mi fa sol la si, another one, you fa another one. I mean, it's very easy for somebody. Yes. So
you must have encountered students who are excellent students, who are articulate and full of original ideas, but who can't draw.
yes, Peter Eisenman.
He has a lot of knowledge.
Yes. No, there are, yes, there are students, but they are, but not today. I must say that was a characteristic of maybe 20 years ago, but you can have students very cultivated, very theoretical, very philosophical oriented, but not gifted, usually coming from the classical high school. But today this attitude doesn't exist anymore. The students, they don't read. I was always telling to my students at Yale, listen, when you read a book and you start to have a very little headache, that is the moment in which something happens in your brain and the knowledge starts to be. If you read a book and you have no headache, it's useless. I mean, just drop it.
Okay, I know this is indulgent, but this is the last one. This is the German photographer Hilla Becker, who worked with her husband Bernd Becker, taking all those amazing photographs of industrial typologies, mine heads and water towers. And this particular clip is Hilla talking in her kind of very sweet German grandmother's voice about how she first obtained a darkroom. She's basically a printer of photographs more than a photographer. So this is her kind of primal scene.
Yeah, there was this time when everybody tried to get out. And it was before the wall was built, so it was possible. You could go to West Berlin, go in a refugee camp. That's what we did later ourselves.
Yeah.
And you had a control, like similar to control that would be between
different countries.
Different countries, yeah. Of course, you couldn't take any luggage, but they would search your handbag.
I see.
But
so your uncle left years before you, and in leaving he gave you some of his things.
Yes.
I see.
He left with the entire family. He was a doctor, and he was. He had a job. Everything was fine, and his house was still there, and it was a beautiful modern house with everything most beautiful. And he asked my brother and myself. We were then about, maybe I was 13 or 14. My brother was even a little older. And he asked us to bring a few things out. First they had to go themselves to make sure that they get out.
Yeah.
And then when we were in safety in West Berlin, they asked us, we need some whatever. I can't remember what it was, towels and some spoons and stuff like that. And then one day the uncle said, don't go back in the house anymore. Maybe one time, but be careful. the summer holidays are over now, and now they will realize that we are gone. But you can still go there and get something that you like. Get something for yourself that you like.
So you did. So you saw the enlarger.
And I made fun of him, and I said, I like the piano. They had this big, grand piano, yeah, beautiful. And I had piano lessons, and I had a terrible piano, really bad. However, and then he said, Hila, you get my darkroom. Go in the basement, have a look. And there was everything. Trays and even chemicals and paper and larger lights, the best.
That's quite unusual, isn't it? That,
very unusual.
That a man in the 30s and 40s has...
Yeah, he was a real
pioneer.
Amateur. It was his little luxury.
Yeah.
It was a middle format, that was very good too. It wasn't... It's very tiny, I never liked that. It was a little... And later I had a Rolleiflex. And
little 6x6.
6x6, and that was great. But I was still going to school, of course.
So you set up the darkroom back in Potsdam.
I set up the darkroom, and my mother was kind enough in this fairly, narrow... It wasn't even a bathroom, really. It was...
Like a little cupboard.
Yeah. Okay, but then, from then... It became really active. Before it was always complicated to make contact prints and...
But now you're set up.
I really set up.
Okay. Now, just recently, again in kind of shameless plagiarism of the Paris Review, I pulled out all of these conversations that I've commissioned for AA Files, and I've published them in a separate anthology. And I actually did this, I had the same volume printed in 3 different colours just to make it seem more of a series. The books themselves graphically fit neatly as a scaled down mini version of the journal. So that little pile of stuff is basically 6 years of my editorial life. And the physical material quality of these things also leads me to my kind of final set of images and the last dimension of editorship, which is graphic design, which I firmly believe is something not separate to the act of commissioning writers and working with text, but become integral to the whole. Now, in its first ever issues, designed by Dennis Bailey in the early 1980s, AA Files was a really elegant magazine, employing simple, even classic graphic design, very much in keeping with the clear, intelligent, no-nonsense articles. Again, here's Robin Middleton piece, very simple title, The One-Room Apartment, and that's what it was. Now, by the time I took over, the journal, although still the same format, had denigrated into an ugly assortment of dodgy parametricism, full of project descriptions or architects talking about their architecture, and terrible titles and really, really nasty graphics. This is like a parody of bad AA work. Here's another spread. Again, the text is a project description, and the title and images are all, eye-wateringly bad. And so what I did is that I basically gave in to a cliché of modern editorship and immediately redesigned the thing, working now with a fantastic graphic designer called John Morgan. And the first thing we did was to remove the image from the front cover of the journal. Because for a journal largely of writing, I wanted people to only to be able to understand it by reading it. With a blank cover, it forces people to turn the front page. Now inside, John and I developed a really elegant, but also quite explicitly English template based on single, double, or triple columns of typography, either ranged left or force justified, with titles and captions and epigraphs center cut into the typography. Footnotes are always endnotes, but as much as I can, I try and actually edit out footnotes. But I think that the true essay should never have footnotes, but trying to get most academics to lose footnotes is really painful. So, of course, they kind of find their way in. And images are either inserted into the text, as you can see in the bottom left, sort of cut into the text again through the center column, or actually much more frequently, as in the bottom right, they occupy a whole page on their own, so that I can have that total separation between image and text. So here then is a typical spread. Very, very simple title. Again, I hate long-winded titles. I like very straightforward titles, or funny titles, or slightly more tabloid titles. A clear separation between text and image, and a very unembellished caption. I separate the text from the image because I really hate the way the integration of images affects the way people write. That is a cliche, another sort of more current cliche of architectural publishing is that you have a kind of meteorite shower of loads of little images inserted into the text, which means that people write as captions, just little short sprints, little tiny chunks of text without any sense of a kind of flow. I think writers are actually much better when they let the words visualize something for them, and then the image, when it does actually arrive, becomes a kind of bonus for that. So elsewhere in the journal I give a real bias towards architectural history, partly because that's what my training has been. I've been trained as an architectural historian, but also because architecture or architectural education or architectural editing without history, for me, is absolutely no fun at all. And I also like to do pieces when architects themselves show a historical awareness. So these, for example, are photographs that James Stirling took himself of English industrial vernacular building. So this is an architect showing an interest in an architecture other than their own. I also like to kind of challenge the digital monoculturalism of the AA by highlighting other aesthetic paradigms. The obvious counter to digital parametricism is sort of tectonic Swiss architecture. And graphically too, you can see this is my homage to 1950s architectural review design. And again, I like to sort of counter other strains within the AA, not least its sort of manic obsession with internationalism, by re-emphasizing the fact that the AA is an English institution. And over the years, there have been one or two interesting English architectural figures. So these are pieces on John Volcker and Ian Nen. Again, so in a weird sort of way, AA Files is a kind of counter-insurgency movement within the AA. So it's a sort of Sandinista guerrilla regime attacking the AA itself. When I'm commissioning texts, I like to sort of act as a patron to a younger generation of writers as well. I'm not in any way interested in the established celebrities of architectural scholarship, mainly because the younger writers are better. They write better, and they're much, much more appreciative when you edit them. And this is also where you see the strength of Columbia, especially its PhD program, that I've commissioned so many pieces by Columbia PhDs. And as I was saying earlier, that it's as if the AA Files is basically Columbia's house journal now. Here's another piece from a young architectural scholar who was actually a distant relative of the King of Thailand. That is the king, her great-great-grandfather on the far right, who was the King of Thailand. And again, I'm just sort of putting it up because graphically it shows that when I have a good image, I'm going to use that image as big as I possibly can. I also like to promote other disciplines. So this is a piece by the landscape historian Alessandra Ponte. Landscape architecture being a particular favourite of mine, having been crushed academically more recently by landscape urbanism, which I hate. Oop. Or here's a piece on the history of science. Again, if I get good visual material, I'm going to do all kinds of graphic tricks with it, cutting out pages, cutting into the typography, so that you still have that classical center-justified, center-orientated typography, but you can kind of monkey around with it a little bit. Or here's one by a fashion theorist on the idea of the model, a subject obviously not unrelated to architecture. or pieces by, this is a piece by a film historian that we began the piece with stills from the beginning of Michael Powell's film, Peeping Tom. Here's a piece by my friend Adam, the psychoanalyst again, about the idea of getting lost. Now, in this text, and others I'll show you a bit later, is for each issue, John Morgan and I use these display letters, just to sort of introduce another sort of typographic dimension. So we choose a different font, or we draw a font to pull out certain letters. And we actually get these done by a typographer, but he does them in an abstract sense. We buy like 5 or 6 letters. So he doesn't know the pieces. So then I have the weird task of having to edit the text to fit the letters I've got. So you've got I've got to begin a sentence with a B. So it becomes a kind of Georges Perec game at the end of every A files. Here's some more display initials. And again, from a piece of writing outside of architecture, this is a new translation of Roland Barthes' Eiffel Tower text. Or this is a text by a new translation of Albers' text. And in this instance, the display initials are Albers' own stencil typeface. Well, this is a text on Alva Alto, and for the displays here, we use this Pouchet. It's a sort of reworking of a 19th century Pouchet font. Pouchet, where you introduce decorative elements inside the letter. But because this was a piece about Alva Alto, about Finland, basically, we put Finnish things in the letters. So there's a Moomin in there, there's a Nokia phone, there's a fish, a rally driver, just stupid little things, really. Or this is a more kind of restrained stencil typeface about a text about 1950s London. Again, deeply unacademic title, but I like that juxtaposition between a very seemingly restrained typography, but there's an element of naughtiness, of mischief there. And that kind of playfulness in titling is something that I really encourage in all my authors. Much more tabloid, much more referential, or just sort of stupid. This is a text about Salinger's fondness for his Molten bicycle. So the title obviously plays off one of Salinger's own titles. And then more generally, I do like kind of a bit of mischief in the pieces I commission. This architectural writing, I think, doesn't always have to be po-faced and serious. And Mark Wigley would really appreciate this one. This is an architect, an actual architect, doing the writing. But his subject, this is Peter Wilson, but his subject is not his buildings, but the love Raymond Chandler had for his 8-kilogram cat, Taki. His cat really was that big. So lastly, just a few images just of the kind of physical qualities of the journal. That in addition to the sort of commissioning of the text, in addition to the conversations, in addition to the graphic design, I like to add into each issue a kind of treat, a little treat. For me, 2 of the most boring words in the English language are online publishing. And given that A files only exist as a material, physical thing, limited by its print run, limited by its costs and its readership, I want to produce something that people don't throw away. And so I add what my printer calls a special to each issue. So in the first one I did, it was a scratch and sniff component. So this was a compliment to an amazing piece of research by Columbia's Jorge Otero Payos, who was researching the smell of Philip Johnson's glass house. And he actually worked with a perfumier who produced vials of perfume of the smell of the house. It was the smell of the house as it was first built, so the smell of brick and plaster and wood and leather. Then the smell of tobacco, of cigarette smoke, and then the smell of its occupants. So he researched aftershave smell and sort of did a composite. So we applied these smells, screen printed them to the captions in the journal. And it worked, it smells, it still smells. Or I introduced different coloured paper stocks. or fold-outs or other inserts scaled into the journal. Or in this issue we reproduced a postcard. It was a piece about collecting postcards. And for that postcard we printed it front and back. But then I had at least 5 of those sent back to me by librarians who thought that I just accidentally left the postcard in. Two of the librarians tried to send it back. They thought it was a real stamp. Librarians. What can you do? Or in this one, to a sort of accompany text on the history of the architectural stencil, we provided a stencil sheet. So that's printed on stencil paper, and it was perforated so you could tear it out. More fold-outs. This is a French fold when you don't cut the paper, so you can introduce like a kind of inaccessible pocket. This was a text about the history and the culture of the undersea. So I wanted a sense that I wanted you to peer into it like an aquarium. Again, more fold-outs. This was a 2-meter long Dance of Death church wall painting from a German church. This is another gatefold drawing. Or in this, this is the last issue I did. It's a kind of pop-up Priapic section from a design Le Corbusier did for a stadium in Baghdad. So we just had laser cut into the journal, the actual section. And you can stitch it into the journal as if it's a page, so it just pops up at you when you turn it. And lastly, as the last of these specials, this was again to accompany a text by another Columbia scholar. This is the great Tao Zhu, who wrote about bigness in Mao's China in the 50s. And he provided all these amazing images of vastly huge buildings. But when I just sort of placed them, designed them on the page, they just didn't look big enough. So we had the idea of putting into the journal the biggest piece of paper we could find. So we reproduced on B1 size, that's the largest full bleed we could do, one of these ridiculously elephantine buildings of Mao's. So this is just my last slide. There is then, to sort of sum up, something slightly paradoxical, perhaps even delusional about the way I see A files. But just as seemingly every architecture school in the world increasingly structures itself as if it were a magazine, with its emphasis on specific singular trends, on media, on branding and identity, and on producing an education as if it were a product to be bought, consumed, and globally exported, I've conversely tried to make the magazine that is A Files much more like a school where there is a plurality, not one informing agenda or thematic, where there's an attention to detail, where things are visual and also writerly, where it's scholarly but accessible, serious but also playful and mischievous, where there is an interest in abstract ideas as much as concrete things, and a school where there is also a pedagogic intent, that I'm providing these things not only because I like them, but because I think this is what people and what students of architecture actually need. And the double paradox to this is that ultimately my model for all of this is not the world's great schools of architecture. So it's not the École des Beaux-Arts in the 1850s, not the Bauhaus in the 20s, Black Mountain College in the 40s, Ulm in the 50s, the Milan Politecnico in the 60s, the AA in the 70s, Cooper Union or UAV in the 80s. But it's actually a media empire. It's the BBC of the 1930s, when it was directed by John Reith. And it was at this point in the 30s that BBC explicitly set itself up as if it were as a university. So it was the BBC under Reith was overcoming damnation or editorship through didacticism. And so, just to end, I think there is a kind of salvation out there. But to succeed, we might have to think of ourselves not as editors at all, but back to the idea of the teacher. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Any questions? Does anyone want to send me something and I'll edit it?
Thank you for your talk. While you were showing us the video of you editing, I couldn't help but think that you sort of, and maybe you said this, you have to sort of adopt the identity or the perspective of the author, and sort of shift yourself, which led me to the question of sort of how does one edit themselves if you do that? What identity do you assume?
As you're talking as a writer, how would you edit yourself?
Or I mean, in our context, you know, we're producing our own work as portfolios, let's say, or you know, translating from drawn and discussed work to a book form. But we also have to, we have the opportunity to edit, to have other people edit, but really we're mostly going to be faced with editing ourselves.
Yeah, I always think that the best editor is the author. And I think that one should always write by constantly reading the text to yourself. So that, in essence, every line you write, you've spoken to yourself first, so that you read yourself into the next line, which means that you might read the first line thousands and thousands of times, because you're always starting again. And then you just start writing, and the moment you stop writing, that is, you run out of ideas, then you have to again read it again and generate that sense of momentum. Because again, I think it all comes from the spoken form, from the oral form, that people nearly always, not just architects, speak better than they write. And that's what's sometimes quite nice about emails, that people are much more fluent in emails. People write so much more in email, and you can always hear someone the way they speak in email form. That's not to say that I want that kind of real, I think sometimes a bit of schizophrenia, becoming a different person, having a different identity is no bad thing. But I like that sense of fluency. I mean, when I teach at the AA, I teach people how to write, teach my master's students how to write, and I do that by insisting on this sort of spoken and then this quick detonation of a series of ideas. And also always writing sequentially, never ever doing that terrible old academic cliche of writing something and then chopping up a text and breaking the sequence. Because in that original oral depiction of a text, is into its DNA is a kind of link between one and the other. When you start moving text around, you instantly break that, and you can hear that breakage, which is what me as an editor would then try and rebuild, try and fill the gaps. So it's never the actual figure of the sentence, it's always the ground of the bits in between.
As it's been reflected at all in the work that actually comes out of the school. So it was interesting to me that, you know, you showed the images of the spreads with the various parametric designs and the sort of self-aggrandizement of the authors in writing those pieces. And I'm interested to hear about how you feel about the change in the helm, you know, as the editor, and the different aesthetic quality of the work, and how that might influence the student body or the actual work that comes out of the school.
I think they're still trying to figure it out. I don't think they've entirely got it yet. I mean, it seems like my most attentive readers are outside of the AA. I mean, it's strange because it is still a house journal, so it's a constitutional thing, as I said. They have to receive it. And so many of them talk about it as a coloured object. They say, oh, the orange one arrived, or the pink one arrived. And I'm like, hey, try reading that thing. But there is slowly and more encouragingly the absorption of an idea of that writing might be one of those things that you would be a good idea to learn in a university. You know, I've had this great fantasy that we could teach, and I think especially for architects, teach writing, reading, and talking. You know, basic tools. I mean, especially for an architect to talk well. I mean, good ones do, but I think you can teach people how to talk. And I think it's a natural corollary of that. to teach people writing and reading as well. So, I mean, there's a certain, what's other nice things in the school is that when you introduce a figure, a historical figure, whoever it might be, I mean, you always see it through Editorial because he's so good at suddenly exposing the value of someone. You know, after he does a piece on Hildesheimer, I mean, the number of Großstadt references you see in student work is amazing. You know, everyone does that. But that's what's encouraging about a school and how immediate that can be, that you can introduce a reference and then suddenly everyone is quoting it. But more generally, in terms of an ability to communicate and to converse and to write, it's difficult. But it's also partly difficult that 90% of the AA is non-native English speakers. So, you know, making a journal that privileges the English language is a really perverse idea in a school as international as the AA. But I think if you're going to come to London, if you're going to come to an English culture, a tradition of writing is something to engage in. And I think if you're going to learn anything in the university, writing would be higher on that list.
Hey, you were pretty theological about saying this is good, this is bad, playing with the pace. But what if an architect wants someone to stuck in a text? What if you're not a writer but a producer of a text, like you're like constructing it, and you want to produce the effect of someone to read it again 10 times, and then maybe at some parts of the text the pace is faster, then it's slower. So it's really it's not like you're designing a corridor, someone's just walking through it. You're designing a structure, someone's just in it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, people do that. I mean, again, often designers do that, or rather more confident tutors. They see no distinction between the visualization, the way they visually perceive a building, or the way they design a building through a series of rigid, repeating components divided into compartmental sections, and then the translation of that into architecture, into the writing. So lots of little chunks, basically, little compartments. And I kind of go along with that to a certain extent, but at the same time, I want fluidity. So I must have used the analogy with those kind of writers loads of times. When I don't want the Rue corridor, I want enfilade. I want to walk through a space from room to room to room to room, rather than in a circulatory system, a modern system, with rooms off it. And often when you describe things in architectonic terms like that, people understand writing a little bit more, what I want. But that's, you know, I think sometimes it works graphically when you can divide up the pages. I mean, there is a natural division anyway in terms of turning a page. You know, trying to keep that flow is difficult, and sometimes it's more easier to separate it. But I'm not going to pander to people who want a kind of mantra-like way of writing, where you're endlessly repeating, when it becomes theological, when you're repeating a phrase or a word, as if in its repetition it suddenly becomes more important, because that for me is the language of the manifesto, which I have no interest in whatsoever.
Expand a bit the idea of the problem with the initiative like ArchiSync, for example, when people is producer and editor at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I've just got just a sort of slight initial prejudice against ArchiSync initially because AA Files is not in it. And I was like, what the hell's going on? Why aren't I in it? You know, it was slightly Groucho Marx. And then I thought, well, you know, I don't want to be a member of this club anyway. I'm not in it. And it was so much predicated off the idea of the independent journal. And then Volume was in it. And I'm thinking, is Volume an independent zine funded by those very insignificant small bodies, that is Columbia University, Rem Koolhaas's office, and the Dutch National Institute of Architecture? Is that independent publishing? And I think too often with the zine form, that at the lower level, you get this sort of kind of cult of the individual, who always celebrates the act of the production rather than the content. So that's why it becomes a graphic design exercise rather than about writing. I mean, people don't quote these things. They simply quote the political structures that engendered them. So someone is a curator slash editor slash producer slash designer. And that kind of amalgamation doesn't interest me so much. I mean, sure, I mean, but also I've just a slightly grouchy resistance to it, because it's also coming out of a kind of blog culture, which is a culture that doesn't believe in editorship. It believes in authorship. And I think we have to be a bit careful with that. I mean, we see it everywhere, in all schools, not just at the AA, where there's so many different initiatives. Sometimes the initiative to launch something new is valued more than just making something good. I think that we should insist on certain quality thresholds. And not necessarily through me, but through any kind of filter, whether you call that filter an editor, a professor, a curator or whatever. There has to be someone who's determining whether it's worthwhile and how it can be improved and how it could also be resisted. I mean, I try and look as many as I can, but it's difficult because there's so many out there. And I kind of like my bookcases at home to have books on them. You know, there seems to be something slightly vacuous about a bookcase with magazines on it. I mean, there are good ones out there, but there's actually very few that follow, that are about writing. I think Log, I always read Log, having worked with Cynthia at Eni. And there's an Italian journal, San Rocco now, which is very, very strong. Slightly full of itself, but still very, very strong. But they have the T-shirt before they have the journal. They have the website before they have the journal. They have the thematic before they have the journal. But I think that there's too many good novels out there. There's too many good movies to see instead of reading architectural journals. I mean, it's a tough one, that one. I mean, I'm very anti the idea of the kind of, there is at the AA and in English architectural education now the thing that's basically the virus that's replaced parametricism is now the virus of narrative, where all design projects are narrative based. So I sit in so many juries and someone presents a project and it's an archival funeral parlor in the clouds over Baghdad that inscribes memories of grandmothers. And the whole description, the project presentation, is a narrative. And then you sort of listen to this for half an hour and then there's nothing you can say. You know, they're waiting for applause. And it does my head in, that kind of form of architectural teaching. And because it's so not loyal to literature, you know, they're not reading any books. They read a little bit of Calvino. They read a little bit of Latin American magical realism. They read a tiny bit of Borges every now and again. I mean, the list of, there's always a bit of Life of a User's Manual. But basically, that's all they're reading. And I think there's, it's not that I want everything to read like a novel, you know. I don't want It Was a Dark and Stormy Night to begin every single text that I read. You know, sometimes the really straight-laced Felicity Scott, who I love dearly, beginning, you know, in May 1972 at the Museum of Modern Art, you know, the really basic beginning to a thing is what you need. But I think that people should read novels because they're interested, because the better reader, the more you read, the better you're going to write. But if I presented it as a sort of crude transition between reading Nabokov or whatever and then writing like Nabokov, it's not obviously like that. actually, back to Peter Eisenman. I mean, I worked with Peter for a number of years at Cooper Union, and we speak every week now just about books, only about novels. I mean, why I love him is because he reads novels all the time, and he's so competitive about it. Everything is sort of locker room competition for him. When I first was teaching with him, I was reading a book on the subway, and he's like, "What's that book?" So first of all, he denigrates it, says, "That book's rubbish." And then you tell him to buy it, then he buys it, then he reads it, then he tells you that you don't understand it. Then, the next day, he gets all of the students to buy the book, and then instead of a pin-up, we discuss the book. Now, how many people are going to be doing that? So that absorption of a kind of different cultural references is wonderful, I think. That, Peter's entirely conversant and fluent in the language of literature, of movies, of music, of cuisine, of football, all of these little things, and I think he believes in the idea of the public intellectual, and I think that's something that sort of endless compartmentalization of our lives and the disciplinary idea. I mean, everyone talks about interdisciplinarity without actually doing it, without actually looking at other things, finding out other references. And I think Peter would be a sort of model of that, someone who's totally fluent in these other aspects of an intellectual life. Sure. Last one.
It's been great to have you here. Thank you very much.